Hello, Since Attlee Churchill listeners. It's Richard here. And this is a special episode of the podcast where I'm going to be talking about the origins and meaning of the US Declaration of Independence, which celebrates its 250th anniversary on the 4th of July this year. And this podcast is based on a lecture which I gave about the Declaration of Independence at the Senate House in London a few weeks ago. But Lee and I thought it would be worth re-recording that lecture in full and sharing it with our podcast listeners, in part because many of the themes in the lecture actually speak to some of the topics that we talk about a lot on the podcast, in particular matters relating to parliamentary sovereignty and the relationship between the Crown and Parliament, about the British Constitution more generally, which were all live matters in the British American colonies in the 1770s. So although this is a podcast about post-war British political history, and this is very much a different war and a different era, many of the enduring constitutional questions are still there. So I hope that you find it interesting. The Declaration of Independence is treated in the United States almost like a holy document. It sits on display in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., in what is effectively a national reliquary. Some countries, like our own, have crown jewels in our national treasury. Some countries, like Russia or China, have the pickled bodies of dead leaders. The United States has this document and the Constitution. And the reverence for the Declaration of Independence is understandable. The first two paragraphs are some of the greatest prose written in any political document. They are expressions of high ideals associated with the Enlightenment. Commentators have called these two paragraphs Shakespearean, on par with the Book of Common Prayer, or even the Bible itself. The most famous of these is the following passage: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." But one of the things that frustrates me about the Declaration of Independence is that it is often only known for these particular words. At best, I think the Declaration of Independence is remembered for the first two paragraphs, which are about 351 words. Yet there's another 1,000 words in the Declaration that get very little attention. These consist primarily of 27 grievances against the king, who at the time was George III. And although they make up the majority of the Declaration of Independence, I doubt that most Americans could tell you that those grievances were even there, or how many there were in the Declaration, or indeed what those grievances consisted of. And so I'd like to use my remarks to broaden our understanding of the Declaration by reflecting on the Declaration as a whole document. What was the Declaration trying to achieve? What actually was it? In spite of its fame and revered status, it remains much misunderstood. I think in order to understand what the Declaration was, we need to begin by stating what the Declaration was not. The Declaration was not a constitution. It was not a legal document. It was not a treaty. It was also not the start of the American Revolution. The first battle of the Revolution had been fought 15 months earlier at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in April of 1775. By the 4th of July, 1776, every colonial governor had already been expelled by the American rebels. The last was the colonial governor of New Jersey, William Franklin, son of Benjamin, who was driven from the governor's mansion in June 1776. He was denounced as, quote, an enemy to the liberties of this colony, and imprisoned in Connecticut for 2 years, 8 months of which was spent in solitary confinement. British sovereignty over the colonies in rebellion was already by July of 1776 not really operable. And I think it's also worth saying that the American Revolution did not begin as a war for independence from the British Empire. This point is so often missed. On what the revolution was initially thought to be about, I have more to say on that later. It's also worth stating that the Declaration was not some kind of pure philosophical expression of Enlightenment ideals, even though these ideals are, of course, present. Thomas Jefferson was influenced by thinkers from the Scottish Enlightenment like Francis Hutchinson, from whom the term pursuit of happiness comes from, for example. John Locke's theory of consent of the governed, of course, makes a prominent appearance. And really, in terms of original philosophical thought, there's very little of that in the Declaration. One of the things that the Declaration, I think, was it was a political intervention. It was an act of politics. And it was trying to achieve, I think, three things, at least. The first was to justify a rebellion that was already taking place. Many of the grievances in the Declaration were not about the relationship between Britain and America before the Revolution, but were actually about the conduct of the British Army while the fighting was ongoing in the previous 15 months. The second objective of the Declaration of Independence was to transform what had been a rebellion, a kind of civil war, into an international conflict, a war between two states. And this was vitally important for the American war effort. The audience for the Declaration was, at least in part, a plea to Britain's enemies. It was a call to France and to Spain to support the Americans in a war against Britain. This, in fact, was a central policy of the American Continental Congress, and it is indeed one of the most significant contributions that the Declaration of Independence makes to the American war effort. Already, French agents had informed members of the Continental Congress that France could provide little aid to the Americans while the conflict was seen as an internal matter of the British Empire. On the 7th of June 1776, so within a month of the issuance of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee at the Continental Congress introduced the resolution to declare independence and was explicit on this point about its connection with international relations. He said, quote, "It is not choice, then, but necessity that calls for independence as the only means by which foreign alliances can be obtained." And third, and perhaps most strangely to modern readers, the Declaration of Independence marked the collapse of an older American hope that the king, George III, might protect the colonies from Parliament. And it's on this final point, one that I think is perhaps the most puzzling to modern ears, that I would like to reflect upon at some length. On the face of it, the Declaration of Independence appears to be a fiercely anti-monarchical document. It contains 27 specific grievances against the king. But I would argue it was nothing of the sort. In fact, the fact that the Declaration is addressed to and about the king is an expression of a certain view of kingship that was already long dead in Great Britain. It was a condemnation of a king for failing to use his independent judgment against the will of the Westminster Parliament and the British Cabinet. In other words, it was a call for a stronger king, not a weaker one. In the imagination of many British settlers in America, the American Revolution, at least in its early stages, can be seen as something of a conflict between Parliament and Crown. But the American colonists were on the side of the Crown, whereas the British regulars were on the side of Parliament. General Thomas Gage records in May of 1775 that, quote, "When the rebels have erected the standard at Cambridge, they call themselves the King's troops, and us the Parliament's." Another British officer, Lieutenant William Fielding, wrote in June of 1775, "They call us Parliament's troops, and themselves the king's loyal and faithful subjects. James Wilson, a signatory of the Declaration of Independence and later the US Constitution, said, quote, "The people of America did not oppose the British king, but the Parliament." Wilson made these remarks at the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and indeed at that convention, Wilson advocated for a strong precedent in the US Constitution, reminding his colleagues that precipitating the American Revolution a decade earlier was, quote, "The opposition was not against a unity, but a corrupt multitude." Wilson argued that a stronger executive was, quote, "the best safeguard against tyranny." The Americans wanted Parliament to butt out of their business, and they saw the king as the actor under the imperial British Constitution who was responsible for preventing parliamentary tyranny against the Americans. As the historian Alan Taylor has written, quote, "Blaming Parliament for their taxes, the Patriots had long looked to the monarch as a potential ally." And this is the crucial background to the origins and meaning of the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, this point is made explicitly in the Declaration. The Declaration says, "He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation." Well, this jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution is the Westminster Parliament, and their pretended legislation are the acts of the British Parliament relating to the governance of the colonies. To the British settlers, they believed that their own colonial legislatures, which were already very well established and had been up and running for decades, were the bodies that ought to make the laws governing them, and then the king was their final executive. 2 years earlier, in his summary view of the rights of British America, Thomas Jefferson sets out this view even more plainly. This was a set of instructions for Virginia delegates to the First Continental Congress. Jefferson called on, quote, "the great office of His Majesty to resume the exercise of his negative power and to prevent the passage of laws by any one legislature of the empire which might bear injuriously on the rights and interests of the other." In Jefferson's view, the king should have withheld assent from the acts of the Westminster Parliament. But this was an outdated theory of kingship. Since the Act of Union in 1707, no British monarch had withheld assent for an act of the UK Parliament, with the lone exception of the Scottish Militia Bill in 1708. This is in fact an eccentric case where Queen Anne's ministers advised the Queen to withhold her assent because the facts on the ground had changed by the time that the bill had made its way through the Commons and Lords. In other words, none of the Hanoverian kings had dared to veto legislation passed by Parliament, and indeed, of course, no British monarch has ever done so since. Yet, in Thomas Jefferson's view, George III needed to do just that. Jefferson knew this history. He knew that George III had not exercised his negative, i.e. his veto, against an act of Parliament, nor indeed had George II, nor indeed had George I. But Jefferson argued that, quote, "the addition of new states to the British Empire had produced an addition of new and sometimes opposite interests." In effect, the Americans were criticizing the king for not acting strongly enough against Parliament. They wanted George III to be bolder than the king was willing himself to be. Now, the royal negative had been deployed within the colonies against acts of the colonial legislatures. But I would argue this is quite characteristic of the relationship of the Crown in the realms still today. Colonial governors and governors general acting on behalf of the Crown have been willing to be much more proactive in withholding assent than the British monarch would ever dare to do, even in the 20th century. We can think of, for example, the dismissal of an Australian Prime Minister in 1975 by the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, something that a British monarch would be very unlikely to do, even though Kerr was acting in the Queen's name. Even here, when the royal negative had been used against colonial legislation in 18th century British America, George III was acting on the advice of his ministers. He was not making some independent judgment about the merits of these policies. Indeed, in some cases, we know that George III was advised to act against his own personal better judgment, but George III believed that he needed to respect the advice of his ministers. In this way, we might analogize between the relationship of the Crown with Holyrood and the Westminster Parliament. As I've mentioned, no monarch has withheld assent for an act of the Westminster Parliament since 1708, basically since the union of Scotland and England. However, royal assent has been withheld from the Scottish Parliament. In 2023, the King withheld assent to the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill, and he did so not because he had any expressed particular view one way or another on the policy, but because he was advised to do so by his ministers in Westminster. In the summary view, Jefferson argued that the king needed to act, in effect, as a kind of representative of the will of his colonial subjects against the will of the British Parliament. He wrote, "You are surrounded by British councillors, but remember that they are parties. They have no ministers for American affairs, because you have taken none from among us, nor amendable to the laws on which they are to give you advice. It behooves you, therefore, to think and act for yourself and for your people." Jefferson is arguing that the king does not need to listen to his ministers when it comes to colonial governance. Jefferson continues, "The great principles of right and wrong are legible to every reader, and to pursue them requires not the aid of many councillors." Now, this just was simply not George III's interpretation of his role as a constitutional monarch. His biographer, Andrew Roberts, has shown that the king did warn his Prime Minister, George Grenville, against the American Mutiny Act 1765, which compelled the American colonial legislatures to pay for the maintenance of British troops in North America. However, in spite of the king's own misgivings, he gave his assent to the bill because he believed that as a constitutional monarch, he had no right to withhold assent from an act that had been duly passed by the British Parliament. Jefferson's view was, "Parliament be damned, be a real king." Some skeptics might object to the interpretation of the Declaration as basically embracing a theory of a stronger king. Hang on, they might say. The Declaration of Independence is a list of grievances against the king, not against Parliament. The word Parliament doesn't appear anywhere in the Declaration. It is only referenced obliquely as this, quote, jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. But I would respond, don't you think that's a rather monarchical move? The fact that the Declaration is made against the king shows that the colonists regarded themselves as the king's subjects, not Parliament's subjects. It reveals their concept of allegiance to the crown. In his wonderful book, The Royalist Revolution, the Harvard historian Eric Nelson has written, "In a sense, therefore, the Declaration stands out as the finest royalist brief of the imperial crisis." Jefferson took the view that Parliament simply had no claim over the colonies, but that is not the same as saying the king had no claim, quite the opposite. In the 1774 Summary View, Jefferson sketches out a history of the Anglo-Saxons. He writes, Our Saxon ancestors left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe, had possessed themselves of the island of Britain, then less charged with inhabitants, and had established there that system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country. Jefferson goes on to say that, quote, those Saxon emigrants then carried on to America, where her settlements were made and firmly established at the expense of individuals and not of the British public. The settlement of America, Jefferson argues, was not borne by the British Treasury, but by those individuals whom, quote, their own fortunes expended in making that settlement effectual. Words very close to these appeared in Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, which was then expunged by the Continental Congress and a drafting committee. Yet in the original draft, Jefferson wrote, quote, settlement here were effected at the expense of our own blood and treasure, unassisted by the wealth or the strength of Great Britain, that in constituting, indeed, our several forms of government, we had adopted one common king, thereby laying a foundation for perpetual league and amity with them, but that submission to their parliament was no part of our constitution. Jefferson's claim that Parliament had never expended funds to support British settlement of America was not in fact true. Jefferson actually conceded this point in a summary view, after declaring, quote, not a shilling was ever issued from the public treasures on settlement. He then adds, quote, till of very late times. That was a reference to the 7 Years' War with France, of which the American theatre was known as the French and Indian War, or, by the French, as la guerre de conquête, the War of Conquest. The war resulted in a decisive British victory, a conquest of New France. This led to Quebec and all of the French lands from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains being transferred to Britain. Parliament subsequently used the expenditures of this war as justifying placing taxation on the colonists. While Jefferson acknowledged this assistance, he argued that financial assistance or military assistance did not entitle Parliament to assume legal authority over the colonies. He argued that Parliament had sometimes provided to, quote, Portugal and other allied states, but these states never supposed that by calling in her aid, they thereby submitted themselves to her sovereignty. So as Jefferson saw it, Parliament's financing of the French and Indian War cannot give a title to that authority which the British Parliament would arrogate over us. Jefferson argued that these British emigrants had their own laws and that their union with the mother country continued by, quote, submitting themselves to the same common sovereign, i.e. the king. Moreover, we see in Jefferson's later writings this same understanding of the relationship between the Crown, the Westminster Parliament, and the colonial subjects in British America. In his Notes on Virginia, published in 1785, Jefferson writes critically about Parliament's usurpation of authority over the colonies from the Crown. Quote, and in 1650, the Parliament, considering itself as standing in the place of their deposed king, and having succeeded to all his powers, without as well within the realm, began to assume a right over the colonies, passing an act for inhibiting their trade with foreign nations. This act, to which Jefferson referred, was the Navigation Act of 1651. He called it a fatal precedent, in which Parliament presumed it could legislate over the affairs of the colony, which they continued to follow even after the Restoration. Now Jefferson, once again burnishing his monarchical credentials, praised the Restoration and condemned the English Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell. He wrote fondly that this colony, i.e. Virginia, still maintained its opposition to Cromwell and the Parliament. And after the Restoration, Jefferson wrote, and remember he's writing here in the 1780s, Parliament was, quote, restored within their proper functions, with the exception that it had assumed the authority for colonial lawmaking. Jefferson used to like that Virginia was known as the Old Dominion, a reference to the fact that Charles II looked favourably on the colonists of Virginia for remaining loyal to the crown during the interregnum rather than supporting Cromwell. Benjamin Franklin, who as part of the Committee of Five in 1776 assisted Jefferson with the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, and as an aside, it's Franklin who is believed to have changed the words, "We hold to these truths to be sacred and undeniable," to "We hold to these truths to be self-evident," which I think rolls off the tongue a bit more easily. Franklin took a similar view. In 1766, Franklin had argued that British Americans were subject to the king alone, and that Parliament thrust yourself in with the crown and the government of the colonies. In Franklin's view, Parliament was guilty of encroaching on the royal power. Now, with all that said, I think it would be misleading to give the impression that Thomas Jefferson, or indeed many of the American colonists, felt personally favourable to George III by July of 1776. Nor did they always agree with the king's use of his prerogative powers when it came to colonial management. Because on the other side of the ledger, the colonists were very cross with a particular exercise of royal power related to the rights of Native Americans against the British settlers. One of the less quoted lines in the Declaration of Independence can be found in the list of grievances against the king, where Jefferson writes that the king, quote, has endeavoured to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Here is an example of where Jefferson and the other colonists felt that George III had misused his powers. Specifically, the Americans were furious that the king had restricted British settlement in the lands that had been conquered from France, which the king had set aside to be, quote, an Indian reservation. That is to say, that those lands should be retained by the Native Americans who lived there and excluded from white settlement. In the Proclamation of 1763, the king declared that all the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, right up to the Mississippi River, a huge stretch which today includes the present states of Ohio and Michigan, Indiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Wisconsin, were not to be settled by British Americans. The Crown forbade colonial governors from authorizing surveys or establishing titles to these lands. The Crown forbade individual colonists from purchasing, settling, or seizing possession of the lands, and ordered squatters on those lands to leave them immediately. The British Army would not protect those who settled in these territories and would order their eviction. Jefferson turns around to say that the king has invited, in his rather exotic terminology, merciless Indian savages against the British Americans. But really, the story here is that the white British Americans had illegally crossed into the lands that the Crown had set aside for Native Americans. And they don't like the fact that they are not allowed to take or buy these lands from the indigenous people, nor was the British military there to enforce their titles against the Native Americans. Now, part of the reason why George III is doing this is because he does not want to commit British forces to patrolling and maintaining the safety of white colonists in these lands. So I don't want to give the impression that George III was doing this purely out of benevolence to the Native Americans. But certainly the white American colonists believed that this was ripe land, good for agriculture and further development, and here was the king siding with the Native Americans against the American settlers. Another even more elliptical line in the Declaration comes immediately before the Indian Savages Clause, where here the Declaration says, "He has excited domestic insurrections against us." Here, Jefferson is making a reference to slavery, the only such reference in the Declaration. It is not a condemnation of slavery, but in fact a criticism of the abolitionist tendencies of the British back home. Jefferson sets out the idea that the king has encouraged enslaved people to rebel against their masters, i.e. he has excited domestic insurrections, a euphemism for slave rebellions. Now the context here is that in 1772, so just 4 years before the Declaration, the House of Lords, in its role as the highest court in Britain, had declared in a case called Somerset v. Stewart that slavery was unlawful in England. Lord Justice Mansfield argued that slavery was inconsistent with English common law principles. Mansfield said, quote, "The genius and spirit of the Constitution forbid the approach of slavery, will not suffer its existence here." End quote. Therefore, if slavery were to be practiced, it needed to be established affirmatively through legislation by Parliament. And since Parliament had never passed a bill affirmatively enslaving people, as Mansfield wrote, England's, quote, "air is deemed too pure for slaves to breathe in it." Mansfield summarized his judgment in his conclusion. Quote, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only positive law, which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasion, and time from whence it was created is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law." Now, the Somerset decision only applied in England, but there was concern in the American colonies, particularly in the southern colonies, that if you had a parliament which could legislate against the will of the American colonists on matters relating to trade, tariffs, and taxation, which was the rallying cry particularly of the northern American colonists, well, this is a parliament that could also abolish slavery in the American colonies without their consent. Indeed, of course, this is exactly what the British Parliament does in the 1830s when Parliament abolishes slavery throughout the entirety of the British Empire. But of course, by that point, the then United States were already out of the British Empire, and therefore this Act of Parliament had no application. And what that meant for Black Americans was another generation, another 3 decades of enslavement under the system of chattel slavery, which would not have been the case had the American colonies stayed within the British Empire. As the first hostilities of the American Revolution broke out in 1775, the British government decided to use emancipation as a weapon of war. In 1775, the royal governor of Jefferson's colony, Virginia, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, issued a proclamation which promised freedom to all slaves who enlisted with British forces to oppose the rebellion. Jefferson was enraged by this action. Not, it should be said, because Jefferson thought slavery was a good or worthy institution, quite the contrary, although he did himself enslave human beings throughout his life. However, he believed that emancipation would be bloody and too dangerous, and out of a form of moral cowardice, Jefferson believed that one had to maintain slavery to prevent a race war in the American colonies. Jefferson firmly believed that the two races could not live together in freedom. Emancipation would lead to, quote, the extermination of the one or the other. In other words, if you emancipated African Americans, they were either going to kill all the white people or all the white people were going to kill them. Lord Dunmore's proclamation encouraged up to 2,000 slaves to flee their Virginia plantations. This caused outrage and alarm by many of the American patriots. At that time, a majority of the inhabitants of Virginia were enslaved, and the Continental Congress urged resistance to Dunmore, quote, to the uttermost. And that is exactly what Virginia's colonial legislature did. They convened in special session in December 1775, not long after the Declaration, to say that all fugitive slaves who were captured would be executed. They condemned their governor for being, quote, deluded by his base and insidious arts. But Dunmore's army of fugitive slaves was able to form together as an entity known as the Royal Ethiopian Regiment, and their uniforms were inscribed with the words, quote, liberty to the slaves. This regiment was not long after defeated at the Battle of Great Bridge, and many of those who did not die in the battle then died of illness. Dunmore himself was forced to flee America in July of 1776, just as the Declaration was being signed, and Dunmore took with him about 300 formerly enslaved people to their freedom in Britain. Dunmore's proclamation would have been front of mind for Jefferson, a Virginian, with these events only taking place in the preceding 6 months before Jefferson wrote the Declaration. Indeed, in his original draft, Jefferson is more elaborate in his condemnation. He claimed the king was, quote, now exercising those very people, that is to say slaves, to rise in arms against us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he also obtruded them. This part of the Declaration was expunged by the Continental Congress, and it should be said, as Andrew Roberts has pointed out in his biography of George III, that the king himself was morally opposed to slavery and wrote extensively about this in his personal papers. The Declaration is remembered for a couple of lines, or at best, a couple of sentences. But as I hope I've shown in this talk, it is far more complex a document than popular memory allows. Although it sits on full display in the National Archives, few care to read or reflect on the document in its full. A great deal of myth-making has been allowed to take hold over its origins and meaning. We remember it as a great anti-monarchical document and the birth certificate of the United States. In one sense, of course it was. It announced that George III was no longer the sovereign of the American colonies. But its attacks on the king emerged from an older constitutional imagination, in which the king had been expected to defend the colonists against Parliament. The Declaration was not simply a rejection of monarchy. It was the bitter conclusion that the king had failed to be the kind of monarch that the colonists had hoped that he might be. The king was no tyrant, but he had to be made out to be in order to transition the American Revolution from an internal matter, an internal rebellion, to a flat-out war of independence, a war between two states. Thomas Hutchinson, a Boston-born loyalist, in his 1776 strictures upon the Declaration of Independence wrote, "A tyrant, in modern language, means not merely an absolute and arbitrary, but a cruel and merciless sovereign. Have these men given an instance of any one act in which the king has exceeded the just powers of the crown as limited by the English Constitution? Has he ever departed from known established laws and substituted his own will as the rule of his actions. Has there ever been a prince by whom subjects in rebellion have been treated with less severity or with longer forbearance? But we don't just need to take the words of a loyalist. We can also take the words of a prominent American patriot, one of the founding fathers, John Adams. Looking back decades later, Adams was not entirely unsympathetic to this point. Reflecting on the Declaration, he wrote, "I was delighted with its high tone and the flights of oratory with which it abounded. There were other expressions which I would not have inserted if I had drawn it up, particularly that which called the king a tyrant. I thought it too personal, for I never believed George to be a tyrant in disposition and in nature. I always believed him to be deceived by his courtiers on both sides of the Atlantic." Yet Adams also understood the power of the document. He goes on in this letter to say, "The Declaration of Independence I always considered as a theatrical show, and Jefferson ran away with all the stage effect of that." That phrase is wonderfully revealing. The Declaration was a form of theatre. But political theatre, I should say, is not the opposite of political seriousness. The Declaration staged the American Revolution before the world. It gave the patriots a story about what they were doing. It turned George III, or recast George III, as from the constitutional monarch into a tyrant. And it staged Parliament as not part of the American constitutional fabric, but as a foreign entity. And that is why the Declaration remains such a powerful document. Its first two paragraphs gave the United States a set of promises larger than the words of the men who wrote them. And those words have been used to elevate American politics, to challenge American leaders all throughout history, and has served as the inspiration for people of all kinds of different political persuasions, from enslavers to enslaved people. But it also has this list of grievances, which tells us something about the narrower, harsher, more contingent politics of 1776. And there are elements of that origin and meaning of the Declaration of Independence which are less elevating, less inspirational, and more uncomfortable to sit with today. But perhaps it's that mixture that makes the Declaration of Independence still a document worthy of our memory today, not because it's some pure statement of high Enlightenment ideals, but because that very document captures so many of the myths and tensions that would go on to define the United States thereafter, right up to the present day. I hope you enjoyed that lecture, that talk about the meanings and origins of the Declaration of Independence on its 250th birthday. And I hope you'll listen to more episodes of Since Attlee and Churchill as normal programming resumes. Thanks very much.